Howdy, folks. Welcome to Deeper. We're a show about the Bible, theology, and Jesus. The goal is to be students of God's Word and God's world because you probably know by now that in the original language of the Bible, the word disciple simply means student. So Deeper is a place for learners. If you have questions, doubts, puzzles, that's not just okay, that's expected and normal. So wherever this finds you, whether you're in the car, maybe you're on a walk or just at home, I hope this is a really value-adding time for you and ultimately feels like sitting at the feet of our teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, the greatest teacher ever. My name is Ryan John Gregg. I'll be your host today. I'm sitting here with my friend Destiny Kennedy, and we've just wrapped up a sermon series called The Great Compassion, Joining God's Mission to Heal the World. And in the last sermon, we studied Matthew chapter 25, which is Jesus' vision of the end of days. And a great shepherd figure himself separates sheep from goats. And the criterion for the separation is kind of surprising. And the upshot is that for Jesus, eschatology, the end game for God's plan, is linked to compassion, is linked to the way we care for the least of these. And that can mess with our theology in some real ways. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46, which is the final passage of Jesus' final sermon in the Gospel of Matthew. And so let's get into it. Destiny, great to see you, my friend.
Good to see you too.
And will you read the passage for us, just get it fresh in our mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start in verse 31.
Okay.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on the left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will also answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them, saying, "Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life."
Thanks. When I got to teach this in church, we went over a lot of Bible stuff. There's a lot going on here, and I'm just going to crash course us real quick through some of that.
Yeah, help us out. What we want to understand, what are the basic elements of this passage that we really need to know in order to begin to dive deeper?
Right. And in the sermon, I tried to do that. So, guys, if what I'm about to say, crash course style, you can go get a more thorough explanation on the link. It'll be there in the show notes for you, okay? But several things are going on here we need to be aware of. First of all, Jesus is doing what he often does, which he is speaking in a Torah idiom. He's putting together a variety of not only sayings, but modes of saying from the scriptures of Israel, the Old Testament. So this whole basic idea of there's these two paths, the path of the sheep and the path of the goats, the path that leads to blessing, the path that leads to cursing. That is a framework that is throughout the Old Testament. It starts in Genesis 1 through 3, where God creates this world of blessing, but humans have, by the end of chapter 3, inverted it into curses. And that's our first hint that there's sort of blessing and curse two ways. As the Torah develops in the legislative material, Moses a couple times breaks out into long expositions of here's the path of blessing. If you keep the covenant, here's the path of curse if you don't. So Leviticus 26 is a long exploration of that. Deuteronomy 28 through 30 is an even longer explanation of that at the very end of Moses' life. And then the wisdom literature of ancient Israel, the sort of the thinking like a sage, how should rulers think, like in the book of Proverbs. It's a two ways sort of, don't go this way, go this way. And Jesus picks up on that a lot in his teaching. So we got to be aware of that. And as an aside, the location of what you just read in the Gospel of Matthew is vital because Matthew is broken up into 5 big teaching blocks strategically to show that it's a Torah of Jesus. The structure is communicating Jesus is a new Moses. He's the prophet to come. And you could do a whole deep study, and it has been done, on the way in which Matthew puts Jesus as a new Moses. So the location of this teaching at the very end of the 5th and final teaching block just puts a huge exclamation point by this whole thing to say, this is super important. So there's that. On the whole sheep and goats thing, there's a lot going on there. Shepherds back in the day, at the end of the day, would separate sheep from goats. Why? Because goats have to sleep inside. They don't have wool like sheep do. Sheep sleep outside, goats sleep inside. So this is a chore from the farm. Everybody recognizes. But as usual, there's layers of Old Testament imagery here because there are great shepherd kings throughout the whole Old Testament. Joseph, he was a shepherd, and he becomes, most powerful person in the world. Moses, he's a shepherd and is raised to great height. David, he's a shepherd raised to great height. And then God is the ultimate shepherd king. Ezekiel 34, God says, I will separate you, sheep from sheep, goats from goats. So this idea, and this is actually prevalent throughout the ancient Near East, the idea of a ruler as a shepherd figure. So Jesus is drawing on that. Probably the most important passage in the background of Matthew 25, however, is the book of Daniel. And Daniel chapter 7, where there is this vision of the people of God are being buffeted and oppressed by these beasts and all these things. And then Daniel sees in his night vision one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven and coming to the Ancient of Days, and to him is given all dominion and glory, that all nations and so forth should serve him. And Jesus has this on his mind a lot at this passage, at this juncture. A chapter prior in Matthew 24, he talks about this. You shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. In Matthew 26, before the Jewish Sanhedrin, the leadership, he says the same thing. From now on, you shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And then here, he says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory. Where's he getting this? He's getting this from Daniel 7. And there's a lot going on there. Son of Man is a biblical title, Ben Adam, or in the Aramaic of Daniel 7, Bar Enosh, that ultimately links back with humanity as it's introduced in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. 2-part leadership team tasked to rule the world in God's stead. So this cryptic title, Son of Man, is pointing to Jesus as a representative human who sort of fixes what's wrong with the human state and reboots the human project. But then the Daniel passage goes on to say, in just a couple verses later, that it's all the saints who receive the kingdom as well. And so there's this dialectic that we see many, many times through the New Testament, that just as Jesus is the Son of God and the heir of God, H-E-I-R, heir, we are co-heirs with God. We also inherit with Jesus his kingdom. And that duality, that tension goes back to Daniel 7, which in turn is interacting with the Psalms, Isaiah. It's all over. So that whole thing is in the background. Then the last thing I'll say, just by way of summary, is this passage, Matthew 25, speaks to the human longing that we see across every culture, every century, the human longing for justice, for a world that is balanced appropriately, and the innate sense that when things are not when the hungry are not fed, when the wanderers are not cared for, when the whole list, when that doesn't happen, something is wrong. And through the whole Old Testament, we learned that impulse within us is from God, because God has that impulse. And the Bible's vision of where the world is going is, yes, humans participate in that project of justice, which is enormously hard. We want it, but defining it is hard, and putting it into practice is exceedingly hard. But that comes from God, and that God is ultimately going to put all things to rights. So this idea at the end of time, God comes to rebalance his creation in a just manner. I think that's kind of part of the big background picture of what's going on here. Yeah,
no, that makes sense. And just kind of as a capstone comment, something I'm picking up on as you describe this is you're kind of expressing and explaining what all of that Old Testament background kind of builds up to and how it informs this passage. Something I was picking up on was the element of a ruler being able to discern what brings blessing,
yes,
and what brings curse.
Yes.
And so in light of Jesus being the ultimate example of that, right, I also see Jesus being the example of the new Adam, and the church following Christ's example also being charged to be able to discern and to judge what brings blessing, what brings cursing, and then to act on that. And we're going to begin to talk about that today. But that was just something that I was picking up on.
You're mentioning something that's one of my favorite Bible passages is in 1 Kings chapter 3. David has just died. Solomon's a young man saying, I'm in over my head here.
Yeah.
God says, that's okay, I'll help you out. What do you want? and here's the thing. He doesn't ask for wisdom, because there's a great word in Hebrew for wisdom, and that's not what he asks for. In 1 Kings 3:9, he says, will you give to your servant a lev shomea, which means, in a wooden translation, a listening heart. And that word listening is also often rendered as obedient. So it's not just receptive, it's activist. It's an activist heart as well.
Yep.
That's responsive. And then the passage goes, and the remainder of the sentence says, give your servant a listening heart, leman lishpot leven tov l'ra, in order to judge between good and evil, which goes back to this problematic from Eden and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it throws us all out of joint. And so the foundation of judicial wisdom, the foundation of wise leadership, in order to bring blessing to everybody, as you said so well, is that receptive, listening, obedient posture, which is very counterintuitive in a culture that is all about sort of entrepreneurial initiative and my 5-10-year plan. Like it's fundamentally from within us, but the Bible turns that around and says, actually, it's at a deeper level. The higher you go in leadership, the more of a follower you need to be. And that's amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's why I use the word discern, because in English, judge tends to have a negative connotation to it. I'm being judged, or I'm judging this, right? But even then, even in that use, we're trying to divide or just, begin to say this is that is this.
Yes.
And good rulership, good use of God's wisdom in the world. Again, I'm thinking the church who's been commissioned to use Christ's wisdom to bless the world.
Yes.
This is our opportunity to learn how God discerns, how God judges against or for something or divides two things. And so I think that goes back to this passage. And in light of that, and with all of that background, what's amazing about this passage is that the sheep and the goats are both kind of surprised at the verdict that Jesus draws from this story. I think they're in it at the beginning, and then all of a sudden they're like, what are you talking about, Jesus?
Right.
What do you mean we weren't there, that we didn't do this or we did do that? When did that happen? Right? There's a shock to the system. Can you maybe flesh that out a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I think it's the sheep who are commended, good job. Really? When did we do a good job?
Yeah.
What that tells me, anyways, is that whatever they were doing, works of compassion, whatever we want to call it, wasn't self-interested. It wasn't them saying, oh, I'm going to do this as my meal ticket to heaven or whatever. They're just doing it for some other reason. We don't know what it is. And then the goats, their surprise is that they have a sin of omission. It's not like, oh, I did all that bad stuff in my life or whatever. The Lord's saying, actually, my beef with you is what you didn't do.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting. So that's why we called the sermon, Everyone You Serve is Named Jesus, and everyone you don't serve is named Jesus. Because when the shepherd separates sheep from goat, he's only formalizing the decision they've already made in their whole life. Because if Jesus in some sense exists in the face of the poor, and I approach that face, then I'm approaching Jesus. And so Jesus says, yes, come to me in eternity. And by contrast, if I avoid the face of Jesus in the poor, he's just going to say, okay, get away from me, because that's what you've already decided. And this also reframes the topic of judgment in the Bible to say, God at a certain level just lets us have our way. Like to say, look, if you're really that opposed to my presence, well, then have it your way, I guess. And so it's this idea that at a deep level, we decide ourselves. But this passage, I think, also raises a real question that messes with our theology a little bit. Because it's like, wait a minute. I thought if I just say the sinner's prayer and tick the boxes, okay, believe in the Trinity and believe in this and that, like, I'm in. Mm-hmm. And God knows I'm a sinner, so I'll keep on sinning and whatever. But as long as I believe, I'm going to heaven. Mm-hmm. And this passage seems to be messing with that a little bit. And Jesus tells stories that mess with people's theology. Think of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
Here's this guy who's a heretic. He's from the wrong people. He believes the wrong things. And yet Jesus holds him up as an example of what it means to fulfill the Torah.
Yeah.
That's messing with my theology. And, when Jesus sets up this thing of like, hey, the end of days, there's going to be two groups and God will judge. But I think his standard Jewish listeners nodding along, and what they're expecting Jesus to say next is, and all the house of Israel shall be on the right, and the sheep, and all the Gentile nations shall be on the left. But he messes with that and says, no, actually, that's not the criterion. The criterion is whether you cared for people. But then that's powerful, but it also is often used as ammo in a sub-biblical theology that we encounter all over that basically just says, look, just be a nice person, right, and God will be good with you. Right. It doesn't really matter what you believe. Who knows? Just be nice, care for the poor, give to charity, and you'll be good with God.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute. Aren't there parts of the Bible that speak against that too? And so, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm hearing this tension where on one side we can make the mistake of moving so heavily towards orthodoxy or right belief that as long as we think we have our ideas in order, we're more or less righteous. Mm-hmm. When in the scriptures, there's no space for right ideas without right practice. Yes. And it has to become an expression of our lives, and really be a demonstrable idea if it's going to be an idea worth having. It can be a right idea, but in terms of what, for lack of better words, counts in the sight of God, what God deeply cares to see is not just appropriate ideas as much as that is a great starting place, but to see our lives begin to conform to those ideas and express what those ideas actually mean, and to do so in a way that actually reaches into the creation that God so deeply cares for. You were mentioning earlier this phrase, seeing the face of Jesus in people, or even just in creation generally, and caring for justice and compassion, and just kind of making that distinction really quick about how what we're not saying is that everything is God. But everything that God created, God deeply cares for, and God very much intends to see to it that those who rule on his behalf also care for it. Mm-hmm. And so I just find it really interesting that we can err on one side to say, oh, only ideas matter, and then err on the other side to say, oh, well, only practice matters.
Yes.
And God is somehow able to marry both.
Yes.
And to really bring his wisdom to life through that.
Yes. Yeah, it's so vital. Very well said. Sometimes, in an oversimplified way, Christianity is seen as a religion of orthodoxy, whereas Judaism is sometimes seen as a religion of orthopraxy. And so Christians care a lot about all that theology stuff, and Jews just kind of want to heal the world. And that's a cartoonish version. At the same time, there's a book, it came out in the late 1800s by a guy named Edwin Hatch, and it's called The Influence and Usage of Greek Ideas in the Church. And it's a very interesting book. We'll link to it in the show notes. The basic question is this. In the first Jesus' followers, sort of the touchstone for inclusion was the Sermon on the Mount. Here's the way of the kingdom. You got to live this way. How, within a matter of a few centuries, did the new criterion for in or out shift to the Nicene Creed, which is sort of a developed Trinitarian sense? And Hatch's argument is that it had to do with the pivot from a sort of a Hebrew-based view to a Greek-based philosophical view. That whole thesis has been challenged in many ways, notably by James Barr. And so that's a complex topic. You cannot overly contrast Hebrew thinking with Greek thinking. But that being said, there has been a tendency to overemphasize the orthodoxy at the expense of orthopraxy without seeing, and here's the basic idea, is that in the Bible, these things are deeply tied together.
They're linked, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And at a semantic level, so the very words in Hebrew and Greek that are translated as faith, in Hebrew, the root is aleph mem nun, which is where we get the word amen. And in Greek, the root is pist. That sounds it kind of sounds bad, but it's pist essentially. Those roots, which are shaped in a variety of ways to mean a variety of things, mean both, or translated both, as faith, meaning a sort of emotional, spiritual, cognitive engagement of some sort, faith, and faithfulness, meaning action, application, praxis. They come from the same word. If I trust God, if I have faith, I trust God, that implies I will become a trustworthy person. I trust God because he's trustworthy. He trusts me because I'm trustworthy. So at a certain level, what I'm trying to get at is the whole question about faith versus works is the wrong question that has not yet perceived the way that the biblical language works and the way in which, for the people who wrote the Bible, for the early followers, these things are indissociable.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying right now is I don't even think we can call it an insight into the Bible, because it's just what the words mean.
Yep.
And so if we try to sort of weaponize one part of the scriptures over against the other in a way that relies on a shallow reading of what faith means and what works mean, that's not going to hold water, actually. And this is what the New Testament is at pains to articulate in many, many places. The book of James, Paul in Ephesians 2, many, many places, to say that these things are two aspects of the same living relationship with God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I understand what you mean just by stating that it can sometimes be an overstated contrast, faith versus works. And we know what is meant by that, but it can be unhelpful when you're trying to parse, especially maybe this text out and a number of others. But it follows so much when you think about the biblical story. It makes sense that even that we're embodied beings, that we are beings with bodies that can accomplish the ideas that start in our mind and in our hearts and spirits. And what I don't want to do is begin to just speak in parts all the time, but we are embodied beings. God created us as whole people that are somehow able to express bodily what it is that these ideas mean and what it is that these deeper truths that are woven into the fabric of what God created, to bring blessing to God's world, God's way. And so anyways, that was just a meditation as you were talking about that. And I think connects back to what you're talking about with faith and faithfulness. In God's world, there is no one or the other. They come together.
Right.
If there is faith, there is faithfulness.
Right. And so I think back in Matthew 25, if you were to read it and say, well, ooh, this is troubling, it seems to be the criterion is works, not faith.
Sure.
That's a surface reading. That's troubling. But with this deeper background, I think you could say, no. This is a judgment on the basis of faith. Because if you are not acting out the faith, it's not real faith.
Right.
And so, and think about a defeater in the Bible on the other end, where, like in 1 Corinthians 13, the famous passage on love, Paul says, if I give everything I have to the poor and I throw my body into the flames, like I'm a radical compassion guy, but I don't have love, I'm still a big zero. And so that's another data point in the Bible that is saying these things have to go together. And I think in that 1 Corinthians passage too, one of the things that I love is the Bible, sometimes God in the Bible asks people to do radical things, but he's also maybe more interested in the daily development of character. And it's not about these radical one-off, I throw my body into the flames. It's about the quieter cultivation of love and character and depth and wisdom and patience and long-suffering and these kinds of things. And so I think that this is where, Scripture is often the best interpreter of Scripture. So we come to a passage that has some puzzles, and you can round out your understanding of it by looking at what Scripture says in other places. And but this impulse is still very alive and well. Like in Israel today, one of the pieces of graffiti you see all over Jerusalem is this little phrase in Hebrew, Derech Eretz Kadma LeTorah, which means essentially kindness is more important than Torah knowledge. And this is a Israeli society today is deeply torn, and one of the sort of the main fault lines is between secular Israelis and ultra Orthodox Jewish communities, and there's a middle ground. There's a lot of what are called dati leumi, which is like people who look more secular. They don't have the side curls and the black hats and stuff, but they're still very religiously
deeply
Jewish.
Devoted.
Yeah, but anyways. That little piece of graffiti, you see it all over. You see it on fire hydrants. You see it on brick walls. It's like stenciled everywhere. What it means is, hey, you may be a Torah whiz and you may know all the like little ins and outs of rabbinic teaching and all this stuff. But if you are not a decent, kind person who actually cares for people, doesn't matter. And so I just think it's interesting that this tension in the Jewish culture of Israel today is still a thing, and I think can we talk for a minute about how this touches down in our life?
Yes, please. Yeah.
I shared in my sermon this time I was seeing this therapist in grad school. I was in dark season, and I have kind of light OCD and was really struggling. Anyways. This guy told me first session, he goes, Ryan, I have some homework for you. I need you to go find someone to serve. and someone that cannot possibly pay you back. It has to be someone that there's nothing in it for you. And you need to serve them regularly. And that will reconfigure things for you. And it was so very wise. This guy's a Christian, and he's tapping into the gospel wisdom that actually what heals us is not more focus on my own problem. It's actually giving myself away. And
that's good.
This is so counterintuitive. The way to fix my soul is not doubling down into therapies and doubling down into all the things that can become a form of coddling, and to say, actually, that's the problem. And this isn't, I mean, I still see therapists, like it's still very helpful for me. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But the idea of find someone to serve, do it today. Don't obsess in a narcissistic mirror saying, am I a sheep or a goat? No, turn that mirror into a window. Actually look out into the world and say, where's my Jesus suffering? Where can I help him today? And that's where the rubber meets the road. And it's not being done out of a guilty sense of, oh, well, now I got to know my meal ticket to heaven is I got to stop and give the bum a, $5,
$5 bill,
whatever. No, it must come from an authentic relationship with God and seeing how God did that first for me. I'm the helpless guy that God was kind to. The least I can do as someone trying to have the family resemblance of someone who's in the family of God is to do the same.
Yep.
And I just love that point where we shift out of biblical study, and I can actually try to see my world in a new way.
Yes.
And see the possibilities of action, possibilities of obedience in a new way. And so what I love about this passage is at the biggest scale, it's tying eschatology to compassion and like the big picture of things. And yet it is like the most micro actionable thing that comes up multiple times a day.
Yeah.
And it spans all of that. And that's wisdom to live by, you know?
Yes.
It encompasses that whole range.
Absolutely. Where we're headed and what God is up to in the world. It's a beautiful thing to get to be a part of, but it's such a blessing also to know that it's part of what heals us too.
Yes.
And there's that reciprocity of when I see Jesus and I give compassion and I give myself because of what God has done for me. And like, there's all these elements at play here. But in many ways that makes me more the human that not just I ought to be morally, but I in some sense become more human. I become what humanness was meant to be in the sight of God, because he's the one who purposed and created us. And I sense that there would be such a rest in that. And I think that's what you meant a little bit by healing. There's a lot of striving and trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to become? What's right? What's wrong? And there's a rest in aligning yourself with blessing the world the way that God has enabled us to do so.
Yeah, St. Augustine famously said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, for we are made for you. And so that's when the frequency comes into alignment, and there's like this deep inner rest.
Yes, absolutely.
And it does have to do with what you said, about being an agent of blessing in the world. That's what it means to lead, is to ensure the blessing of others. And that if God showed what it means to be God by emptying himself and not to the race to the top, the race to the bottom. That's what it means. Yeah. That's what it means to be God.
The race to the bottom.
Whoa. Wow. And so that's something that's not just interesting here, but it's like deeply challenging here. And I guess we should put a pin in it there for today, huh?
That sounds good. It's been a good conversation. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, food for thought. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to Ryan@thebay.church or Destiny@thebay.church. We'd be happy to answer it. You do have that email, correct?
I do have that email.
Deeper is a ministry of the Bay Church. We're in the California Bay Area. I would love to see you at one of our services sometime, either online or physically in person. You can go to thebay.church to find out more. And check out the show notes for some links to things that we talked about. And until next time, as the rabbis say, shalomi, my homies. Okay, bye-bye.